The world is vast and full of wonders. Have you ever seen a cold water machine made of clay? Such a clay cold water machine not only ensures the hardness of the clay surface, but also collects water to cool down. In some hot regions, a clay cold water machine that doesn't require electricity for cooling is indeed a great invention. Let's take a look at its manufacturing process. When we arrived at the factory, various sizes of clay jars were already displayed outside. However, these are not the cold water machines we are talking about. The worker, Ade, picked up a clay jar and brought it to the workbench. After scraping off the surface clay, he turned around to get a large piece of clay. He skillfully operated the machine, shaping the clay into the form of jars. The nearby clay underwent the same process. Compared to the clay pulling machines we usually see, this type is much more efficient. He aligned the two finished containers and secured them together, then used the remaining clay to fill the gaps in the middle. He moved the filled jars out to dry in the sun and repeated the process with another. From Ade's skilled operation, one could tell how proficient he was in the manufacturing process. Despite appearing relatively young, he is actually a veteran in the factory. He started working in the factory at 18, and now he has 21 years of experience. When he first came to the factory, he was accompanied by several of his brothers, but in the end, only he persisted. He told us that he fell in love with this craft as soon as he started, so he learned diligently and developed a superb skill. As we spoke, Ade finished making another clay jar. He moved the clay jar to an open area. After some time of drying in the wind, the clay jar gradually became hard. Nick sat on a small stool and was responsible for the next steps. He first scraped off the protruding parts from the surface of the clay jar. The drying time was strictly controlled. Although these clay jars had become very hard, the clay inside still contained some moisture. Therefore, when Nick scraped off the surface clay, it did not cause the jars to crack or break. One must say that the attention to detail was very well done. After removing the protrusions from the surface, Nick began to shape the patterns on the surface of the clay jar. For areas that were too dry, he needed to wet them with water before starting to process, to avoid damaging the outer layer of the jar. Once the surface of the clay jar became smooth, Nick used a tool to drill a small hole at the bottom of the jar. He then began to carve patterns with a knife. His movements were very skilled, and there was no need for measurements. He could draw exquisite patterns on the surface of the clay jar effortlessly. After drawing a few lines, Nick started carving the patterns. His carving technique was very swift and clean, without any hesitation. His carving style reminded me of a type of food called knife-cut noodles. After a period of carving, the clay jar was adorned with delicate patterns and was ready for firing. While we could only see them placed in the open area, there was actually a kiln underneath where they were set. Workers in the distance were continuously adding firewood to the kiln. This firing method is aimed at protecting the outer layer of the clay jars. After some time, the workers took the jars out of the kiln. At this moment, the surface of these clay jars formed a protective layer that can prevent the clay from turning into cement upon contact with water. Moreover, their color had also changed significantly. Compared to the previous earthen color, the clay jars had now become much more vibrant. This kiln can produce over 2,000 clay products at once. The finished clay jars have a very uniform hue, and the quality is excellent. The workers then assembled the other components onto the clay jars. The small hole left earlier serves as the water outlet, which can be fitted with a faucet. As you can see, the rough shape of a cold water machine is now completed, and its interior is also very smooth and even. He poured drinking water into the cold water machine, covered it to prevent dust, and through the evaporation of the clay, cold water could be produced. This way, even without electricity, one can still enjoy cold water on hot days. What do you think of such a cold water machine?